I am Art Kagel, and we're going to talk today about data export and data import utilities and the relative merits of each one. And a lot of time, we're going to spend a lot of time on performance. And then I'm going to concentrate on some of the features and options in the myexport, myimport utility package, which is a replacement for DB export and DB import. So we'll see how that works. Let me get started by saying we're going to cover unload and load from DB access. We're going to talk about DB load for data loads. We'll talk about using external tables for import and export. We'll talk about using one of my utilities from my utils2_ak package, which is the ul utility, which does binary exports. And interestingly enough, even though I wrote it about 18 years ago, the file format it produces is compatible with a binary Informix mode external table unload. So you can unload with UL and load it back with an external table or vice versa, which is very cool. We'll talk about unload and onload. Not my favorite utilities, but we'll talk about that. But they do work very well. We're going to kind of glance over the high performance loader for a couple of reasons, and I'll talk about that a little bit when I get there. We'll talk a little bit about Jonathan Leffler's SQL command package and using it for loading and unloading. We'll look at some benchmarks and maybe make some live runs. So let me start out by coming over and sharing my desktop. In this window, I have a set of load scripts that I've created, and in this directory, excuse me, there we go, I have a bunch of unload scripts, and we'll take a look at all of these. So the simplest way and the way that everybody first learns to unload data and load data from an Informix database is, of course, using DB access. And if we do that, let's see, where's that script? Here we go. What I've set up is two databases. One is a small database that has only 2 tables in it. Let me take a look at that first. Let's see. There we go. Okay, which has 2 tables in it. One is, there we go. One is a table called big text, which has a 4,000 byte char field and a big serial field. And the other one I call big numbers. And that has a serial and a big int, 2 big ints. And there's a trigger attached to that table that does some calculations on the two other fields as the serial numbers are assigned. So what we end up with for each of those columns, let's see. Are some very big numbers. Okay, I initialize the serial number to a large initial value and do calculations off of that for the other 2 columns. So we have some very wide numbers. And I did that to show the difference in performance and efficiency between binary and text-based exports. And so we'll take a look at what that means as we go through things. Okay. So going back to here, all right. So typically, the first thing we learn to do is to unload using DB access, right? So here I've got a script that uses time to time the unload. It runs DB access in command line mode, okay, with a here script that just does an unload, all right? And if we execute that, it's just going to run. And big numbers has 16 million rows in it. So that will run for a minute or so. And that's just basically the first thing we learned to do. And then of course to use db load, I'm sorry, load the table again. Okay. And so here in this load script, I'm using db access to truncate the table, put it into raw mode, load the data, and alter the table back to load the data here and convert the table back to standard mode. Okay, and the timing includes the conversion back to standard mode, which only takes a fraction of a second to do that. And the truncate is retaining the storage, so there's no overhead to creating new storage. The table's already been loaded once when I started, so all the space has been allocated. We just have to reload the data in. Okay, and over here, our first run is finished. It took about 27 seconds. Okay, to run, and you can see there are 16,431,000 rows in the table. So it's a significant table. Okay, the other table is the big text table. That has about 240,000 rows in it only, but of course each row is 4,008 bytes wide. In an export file, they're a little narrower than that, of course, because the trailing spaces get squashed out. And that's to show the difference, and I left spaces at the ends of the strings to show the difference between a fixed length export using external tables and a delimited um, export using external tables. So we can look at all of that. Okay. What I want to look at now are some of the timings. So here's the first set of timings. Let's simplify this a little bit. Okay. So these are the unloads for the big numbers table. And you can see there's 16 million rows in the table. The unload files are various sizes. The delimited files, of course, is all the same size, whether it comes out of DB access or the external table unload. But the various other formats create different sized files. So for example, the fixed file is quite a bit larger, okay, than the delimited file, and the binary file is quite a bit smaller than either of them. Okay, and that's of course because even though some of those numbers are physically wide when converted to text, they're all 8 bytes each, and that's fixed size. So that's the minimum, pretty much the minimum size you can get this down to without compression. Okay. And you can see timings here for DB access for external tables with delimited, or like the default, using fixed format, using the Informix binary format, and then running my ul utility with its default options, with the sync option, which writes data in synchronous mode to the disk, rather than letting it sit in the queue until the operating system flushes it out, and with a larger buffer size um, so that more data is fetched into memory at a time before passing it on, or before writing it out to disk in this case, or in the load file, rather before it flushes it out to the database. And the same thing with on unload. We've run it. I've run it with a 4K buffer and with a 2 meg buffer. Block size rather, 4K block size and a 2 meg block size, to see if there was a significant difference in performance. And what we can see is there is a huge range of performance here between the different options, right? It took 21 seconds the last time I ran this. It took 26 seconds when we ran it just now, but that's the difference between one thing and another, and also the load on my laptop. Right now, I'm running the WebEx to do this, to do the recording for this session, so that has some overhead on the system. Things are a little bit slower. But when I ran it, I believe this was yesterday, it ran in 21.12 seconds. Okay. Whereas an external table unload for using the same file format, and after the unloads, I verified that all these files that are supposed to be identical are indeed identical. That only took 10.77 seconds, so roughly half the time. So we can see from this that at least for this data format, external tables are significantly faster than using unload. Okay. A little bit slower if we do fixed file format, and again, that's because we're writing more output, right? Again, the file is 20% bigger, maybe 25% bigger. But if we run it in binary mode, where we get a file that's less than half the size of the unload file from DB Access, it ran in 3.7 seconds, under 4 seconds. So far, so that's the fastest for this data set, right? Then I took a look at using my UL utility, because why not? I wrote the thing, and I'm kind of proud of it. So I said, oh, let's see how that does. So that ran in 12 seconds, which is somewhere comparable to doing an external table unload in fixed format, but significantly slower than doing the external table to binary format. And as I said, the file format here for UL is compatible. The default file format, it has a couple of file formats. The default file format is compatible with an external table in Informix binary mode. And 12.5 seconds in if you use synchronous mode. So that's a little bit slower because, of course, we're waiting for the data to flush to disk instead of assuming it's safe once it's in the cache. Okay, and again, it was a little bit faster, marginally faster if we used a bigger buffer. Okay, a lot of people like to use unload and onload. They're not my favorite utilities, in part because I have seen them corrupt the server. And indeed, on Sunday, when I was doing some initial testing with it, I actually corrupted both tables twice each. And had some trouble dropping them and recreating them because the unloads had not completed, because the server had run out of disk space in one case and memory in another case. So that's why I'm not a real fan of unload and onload. Okay, unload is fairly safe, but it's the onload that always worries me. And I have used onload in these tests for individual tables and also for the entire database. So we'll take a look at that. At any rate, the unload with the 4K block size was comparable again to a delimited unload as far as runtime. And the file format that it produced is a little bit bigger than the external table binary unload. Okay, which may be at least part of the difference in size. The rest of the difference in size is that it carries a lot of overhead with it. It carries the metadata for the table, the schema for the table, etc. So it's an all-encompassing package, right? When you do a load for any of these other formats, you've got to create the table first and create all the metadata for it. And again, it was about 25% faster using a bigger block size, all right, because you're doing fewer writes, fewer physical writes. So that's for the binary data. And then I wanted to take a look at what happens when we have that text data. If you remember, the text record encompasses a 4K character string and an 8-byte integer. All right, so it's 4,008 bytes on disk. In an unload file and a delimited file, some of that space gets squashed out, and in a fixed length file or a binary file, a lot of it does not. And we can see significant differences in size here. Right, the output from unload is only 32 meg, as is the output from the external table in delimited mode. And they ran for roughly 27 seconds each. So they were comparable. So unlike the binary output, right, binary data rather, unload external tables was not significantly faster when the entire thing or most of the data is text. So that's something to keep in mind, right? We always say external tables are fast, but it depends on what data you're unloading and in what format you're unloading it to. So in fixed format, the data file was 870 megabytes. So that is some, what, um, 2.5, 3 times, almost 3 times the size. I'm sorry, almost 30 times the size of the delimited file. All right, so a lot of space got squashed out in the delimited file that didn't in the fixed length and in the binary file, which is almost as big. And so they took about the same time to export, even though the per row export time is much faster, right? Or per byte export time is much faster. They were exporting much more data to disk and doing much more I/O. Okay. All the other output formats, by the way, had similar file sizes, right down to the unload. Okay. And that reflects the fact that they're all exporting these large character strings that have a lot of white space in them. UL was again just slightly slower than an external table, either way. And on unload, though, here was noticeably faster than any of the other methods for this file. And again, slightly faster, maybe 20% faster, with a 2 meg buffer, 2 meg block size, rather than a 4K block size. So that was interesting, and makes a really big difference compared to unloading the table that had just 3 binaries in it. Okay. So then I said, okay, well, what about if I did the whole database? So now we're comparing DB export, right, to other tools, to on unload, and to myexport, primarily, so we can see what happens with that. So DB export, okay, produced a directory that contained 876 megabytes of files. That includes the schema and the unload files, and it took about 70.5 seconds to run. myexport in its default mode, which uses Jonathan Leffler's SQL unload utility, which, by the way, is slower than DB access, something I was not aware of because I've never benchmarked them against each other before. But I did some independent tests when I saw this result. So that was about 35% slower than doing a DB export. Okay. In part, that's because it also includes a lot of more metadata than the DB export, but the results of that export are compatible with DB import. You can take this .exp directory and import it with DB export. You can also, by the way, take a DB export directory and import it with myimport. So they are most of the time compatible, with some exceptions we'll talk about later. Now, if you pass in the -m option, which we'll talk about later, breaks up the schema so that indexes are created after the tables are loaded. Without the -m option, the indexes, the entire schema is created first, which can slow down the import rather, on the other side. So this creates separate SQL files for myimport to use to recreate the database. With the -e option, we're using external tables to delimited files in deluxe mode. So this is equivalent to the default the delimited exports, the external table exports that we did above. Okay, and that ran in 53 seconds. So that ran in about 30% faster than DB export, and that's in default mode. Okay, if we put the database, if we run it with the small e, then we do external table unloads in express mode. According to the documentation, doing an express mode unload should not make any difference in the performance because nothing different is supposedly happening. That express mode only has a serious effect on loading, and we'll talk about that later. But apparently it does make a difference, and this was consistent. We ran about 50 some odd seconds for the delimited export in deluxe mode, and around 30 to 35 seconds when I tested it with the small e in running in express mode. So that was interesting. Okay. And then I tried to add the -B option, which does the same thing as the lower e, except that it unloads in Informix binary format instead of in a text format. Okay, so if you do a myexport -B, the .exp directory is no longer compatible with DB import because the files are binary, but you could load them with external tables manually if you wanted to, in marking the external tables as Informix mode tables. And that's what we do. That's what my import will do when it runs that directory. It automatically detects the files as binary files, and it will load them that way. Okay. So I said, okay, let's take a look at on unload. So on unload, again with the 4K block size for the whole database, produced a slightly larger directory or file than even myexport in binary mode. And it ran about comparable to a myexport in express mode in text limited format as far as runtime. And again, it ran about 20% faster with a larger buffer, larger block size. I keep getting those confused in my head. So that was interesting. So now there's another database called Testdb that I use all the time for regression testing for for my schema and for DB export and DB import. So I said, let me that has a lot of tables in it and is a bit smaller. It's about half the size overall of the TechTalk database. It only has those two large tables in it. But this has many tables, some of which are tiny, some of which are empty, some of which are fairly large. Okay, so that was a 500K unload of roughly 10 million records overall across all the tables. Okay, DB access, right? All of these were writing to /temp. Okay, which on my laptop, which is a Linux box, is an in-memory file system, so it was about as fast as it could get. And I did that with all of these, by the way. So DB export writing to /temp took 18.17 seconds to unload this database, whereas a default myexport, okay, with no options, ran for 41 seconds, a little more than twice as long. However, in external table mode using delimited files in deluxe mode, we ran in 13.98 seconds. So about 20% faster than DB export. Okay. And in under 12 seconds consistently using express mode unload. Okay. And in binary form, and here was interesting, doing the myexport in binary mode and in Informix mode only took 6.7 seconds, and that was consistently under 7 seconds for my testing. So that is less than half the runtime of myexport, and a little more than a third the time, the runtime, maybe 2.5 times faster than DB export. So that was interesting, considering that the myexport in binary mode for the TechTalk database was not all that much faster than the myexport in delimited mode in Express. But it was similarly faster than DB export either way. So that's the unloads. So then I wanted to say, okay, well, now let's load the data back, because that's often very different. Okay. And as I said, for most of the loads, I truncated the tables. For the DB imports and my imports, and for the onload of the full database, I dropped the entire database and let it recreate as an unlogged database. All right, so we would get maximum performance. And in the cases where I only dropped the table, or truncated the table rather, I converted the table to raw mode before doing the load and back to standard mode afterwards, as I mentioned when we looked at one of the scripts. So for the, let's go back here, for the big numbers table, okay, DB load ran for 112 seconds, so just under 2 minutes, versus an external table in delimited mode default format, which took 67 seconds, just over a minute, okay, and a little bit faster for fixed length records, and about 30% faster for binary records. And this is again the big int table, right? And again, a lot of that is because the binary file is significantly smaller for when the data is binary versus when the data is text. Okay, and this may not be so when the text is when the text fields are fully filled out. Okay, or for when you have a lot of lvarchars and varchars, which are not bigger on disk than they are when they're delimited, right? So keep in mind, every piece of data, every table, every column is going to perform differently, but this is giving you a handle on what you have to look for. UL was a little bit faster at 58 seconds in default mode. When I turned on the -I, which basically says to sync the data out, okay, then I'm sorry, then it ran a little bit slower in sync mode. I don't know why, because it shouldn't have made a difference. And with a big buffer, it was again a little bit slower. So that reflects the time it takes to ship the data across to the database server, which is happening in over the network, but within the within the LAN card. It's not actually going over the network. The server is running locally on my laptop. I forgot to mention that. Onload was a bit faster at roughly 55 seconds. And it was pretty much the same overall, looking at the different iterations of and tests when I used a larger block size. And again, the block size when you onload has to match the block size when you unload. So it's important when you do an unload to make a note of what block size you use to unload the data. Okay. If you use a larger block size, you get a bigger file, among other things. Okay. So looking at the text table, right? DB Access ran that in under 50 seconds, as did DB Load. All right, DB Load, I expected DB Load to be considerably faster. It was not. But an external table load using delimited data was pretty much a little more than half the speed, half the runtime, almost twice as fast. Okay. But in fixed length mode, it was not as fast as in delimited mode, obviously, because the file is considerably larger. Right? Remember, we're talking about loading a 32 meg delimited file versus an 870 meg fixed length file, right? Or in the case of the next test, an 870 meg binary file. Okay. And again, UL, the binary file was about the same speed as loading the fixed file, because pretty much they were the same size, right? Because of the nature of the text data. The UL loads were a little bit slower than even DB Access, regardless of the options. And surprisingly, onload was very slow. Twice as slow as the DB Access load, and more. All right. In the case of the 4K block size, it was almost 3 times as slow as DB Access load. That was very surprising for me. And the file sizes are comparable to the other binary loads. So that was very surprising. Okay, looking at the whole databases, DB import loaded the DB export files in 105 seconds. My import loaded the my export files from the same default unload in 128 seconds roughly. And those all the times here were fairly consistent, give or take a second or less. The my export in delimited using external tables using deluxe mode was 20% faster than DB import at 88 seconds and change. And using express mode was much faster at 54 seconds. All right, it was took half the time that the DB import did to run that. I did test using my import in parallel mode where it will load multiple tables in parallel. The times were within 10% the same, regardless of whether it was a single thread loading or 4 threads loading or 20 some odd threads starting off. But of course, there were so many empty tables that was probably fewer than 6 threads that ran for a significant amount of time. So that was surprising to me, but maybe not. My laptop only has 2 Intel processor cores, so it's not a particularly powerful machine. If I ran that parallel test on a machine with 12 or 24 or 36 cores, we might have had a different result. Okay. At any rate, loading the Informix unload, right, the binary format unload, which again is about 50% bigger than the delimited unloads, it was a little bit faster than the delimited express mode. And by the way, binary imports run in express mode by default. Okay. And for an express mode load to work, the database has to either be an unlogged database or the table has to be in raw mode when you're doing an external table load in express mode. If the table is not a raw table or the database is not unlogged, then it just defaults to being deluxe, even if you specify that it's to be express. Okay. Again, on load was considerably slower than any of the other methods. Okay, it was about 70% slower than DB import and almost 3 times slower than the best runs from my import. Okay. Then I did the same thing with the Testdb, right, which has again more tables but less data. And that showed pretty much consistent results. Okay, the Informix mode binary export, when we imported it in binary mode, in express mode, it was the fastest. It was nearly half the speed, half the runtime of DB import, or the default my import. Okay, and also a good 25% faster than delimited mode. So those are the different tests, and if you have questions, post them in the chat. And we're going to move on to taking a look at the different utilities and what their options are and how they work. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about these. I like DB load over using DB access load, even though it's not considerably faster for any tables that have a large number of rows or massive amounts of data in them, very large rows, simply because DB load will commit every n records, which you can specify, and that avoids long transaction rollbacks, which is a significant problem when you're using DB access to load a large table. Not an issue on exports and unloads, but DB load doesn't handle that anyway. External tables on export, it seems that even on export, doing an express mode export, either to fix either to delimited format or Informix format is the fastest way to export the data for many types of data. And again, the data itself is going to be critical to determining that. If you have a lot of binary data, the binary mode output, Informix mode output, is considerably smaller than the delimited format output. If you have a lot of text columns which have a lot of white space in them, that a delimited file is going to squash out, then often the delimited format will be faster anyway. Okay. And you can do a delimited load in express mode, as we saw, and that is faster typically than a deluxe mode text load. So that's something to keep in mind. I like my little ul utility anyway, even though it doesn't stand up performance-wise to external tables, but it is a nice little utility. And as I said, the default unload format is compatible with an Informix mode external table load or unload. Okay. Okay. The elephant in the room is the HP loader. People have reported, and I forget who it was, someone did a presentation at the latest IIUG virtual conference about the high performance loader and showing how fast it is and how easy it is to use. I have never found it easy to use to this day. In fact, if you do an HP a high performance loader mode, unload or load using myexport and myimport, it uses myonpload, which is a utility that somebody wrote that's in the IIUG repository to manage HP loader sessions. And that's what it uses by default. It can use onpload because when that utility came out, I recoded it to do that. So that is an option. But again, not my favorite, and I don't think it's enough faster than external tables using the right modes to make it a better choice overall. Jonathan Leffler's SQL CMD package, right? SQL command and the its links, SQL unload and SQL reload, which are just links to SQL CMD that save you from having to enter a couple of command line options to unload and load data, respectively. Are easy to use and offer many, many different data formats. Let's see, SQL CMD-H. Okay. If you look at the formats, it supports unload format, which is the default, which is the format that DB Access uses. It supports fixed length format, which is compatible with the fixed length Informix export. External table export. It uses fixed length with a separator, and you can specify the separator. So think of that as unload, but with all the trailing spaces left in. Okay. Fixedel, I've never quite understood what that is. I haven't played with it enough. It will create a CSV file without quoted strings and with quoted strings rather, and it also has a quote mode, which essentially lets you specify the delimiter as something other than a comma, and it quotes strings. So think of that as an option to do unloads with quoted strings. It will produce XML data or HTML data, and the latest version also does JSON data. And I believe block, which is also new and I haven't played with it at all, is a binary format. But I'm not, as I said, I haven't played with it much at all or at all. So I can't speak to it much. It does have a lot of options for setting the delimiter, setting the escape characters, and the record form characters and other things, as well as sorting options, which is unusual. So it lets you do the equivalent of an order by during an export, which some of the other utilities won't let you do. Obviously, in DB Access with unload, you can specify an order by. Okay, so that's one option, but again, generally it is slower than the other options, including DB Access. Okay. And then external tables, we talked about that quite a bit. Um, it is 2 to 6 times faster than unload, um, I'm sorry, it's 2 to 6 times faster in delimited mode than DB access. It is even faster for binary files versus an unload, um, except for character data. For character data, it's sometimes faster, it's sometimes not faster. But in express mode, especially in binary format, it will be faster. Okay. So that's the different options, except for we haven't talked about my import and my export. So that's what we're going to do next. Okay. Let me just do this. If you run my import or my export with no flags, it will print out its usage. The basic format, okay, for my export is the same as for DB export. I tried to make the command line as compatible as possible. So a minimal my export line will look like this: my export, um, the name of the database, and a -o option with some path, where to put the .exp directory. So that's the path to put it in. So there'll be a path / database.exp directory created with all of your data and metadata in it. Okay. Um, there have been problems with using dot with the -o. So I try to use $pwd instead. I've tried to fix that. I'm not 100% sure it's fixed, so keep that in mind. All right, but that's the default and the basic run. But we have a lot of options, so let's take a quick look at that. Okay. Um, There is an option, a -n option, if you already have a schema file and you don't want to spend the time to create a new schema file. My export uses my schema from my utils2_ak package to create the schema. Um, and under certain circumstances, that is a little bit slow. Under others, it's faster than DB schema. So there is an option to use an existing schema file. It would have been created by my schema -l. You can't use a schema file created by DB schema because it doesn't contain the information line that DB export creates in the schema that it produces. And we try to keep compatible with that. And my schema uses that information line to name and create the export files. Okay. So that's important. But my schema -l creates a compatible schema file. Okay. If for some reason you have to stop your my export in the middle, there's a -r option. You can do -r table name. That will assume that you have a schema already, and it will pick up the export with the name table and begin again from there and skip all the tables that would have been unloaded already before you stopped it or it crashed or whatever. Okay. -p option enables unloading in parallel. There's no way to limit the number of parallel threads that my export creates. One day I may put that in, but for now, if you do a my export -p, it will unload every table at the same time. So you've got to have a really big, powerful machine and very fast storage to make that work. But it is a possibility, and it's fine for smaller databases or very large databases with a small number of tables. It works very well for. Okay. There's a .f option which creates the tables with filtering. With the filter tables created, so that if there are any anomalies in the data, because my export does not lock the database the way DB export does, we have 3 other methods for making sure the database that the data that's exported and the database it produces is consistent, but we don't use a lock on the database the way DB export does. So this is one method, is to use the -f to filter out records that violate constraints. It creates the violation tables for every table, and creates all of the constraints with filtering enabled. Okay, that's one of the ways that we do that. I'll talk about the other two in a moment. I want to talk about the different unload formats. So the default format, of course, is compatible with DB export and DB import. So if you do a very simple command line like this one, you will get a .exp file directory that looks almost exactly like the one that DB export creates, and you can load it with DB import. Okay. And if you add the -m option, small m option, um, then myexport will break out everything except the create tables into a separate script, and so that the tables get created before the data load. If you try to load that with DB import, it'll work fine, but the indexes and permissions and constraints and indexes, all that stuff, will be in the second schema file named database2.sql in the exp directory, and you'll have to run that manually after DBA import completes. So at that point, once we've split out the files, it's no longer fully compatible with DB import, but at least partially. Okay. -E does an external table export in delimited files in express mode. Okay. -E does the same thing, but it not only does the export in express mode, but it creates metadata files that my import will use to load the data in express mode, which, as we saw, is much faster. Okay. And the -B option does the same thing, but it uses binary Informix mode rather than delimited mode for the file format. Okay. The default is equivalent of passing the -U, which uses SQL unload from Jonathan Leffler's package to do the actual unloads. Okay. What else? The -I option is a no-op. Somewhere along the line, I removed it and I didn't take it out of the help. I don't know why I didn't take it out of the help. It was taken out because it doesn't seem to make a difference in performance, so it was didn't make any help. Okay. When you do the unload using the high performance loader, you can do that in dirty read mode, committed read mode, or cursor stability mode. Okay. And that uses on pload to do a high performance loader unload. That works. If you pass the -Z option, each file is compressed as it's unloaded. So it is unloaded in a pipe through gzip to a compressed file. If you run my import against that .exp directory and it sees, it will recognize that the data files have been zipped, and it will pipe them through gunzip to do the load. Okay, so that is automatically reversible. You don't have to remember that you zipped up your files. The second way, well, let's do this. Okay, don't worry about -A. It has to do with one of my data migration utilities, so nobody needs to use it. If you're running in SQL command in the default mode, and you need a password, username and password to connect to the database, this is how you pass them in. Okay, and obviously you need both. I mentioned the -M splits out indexes, constraints, SPL, to a second schema file. You can pass -A instead, and you'll get multiple files. One for stored procedures, one for indexes, one for constraints, one for permissions and privileges. And it uses my schema to produce all of those files. If you do use capital M instead, that's exactly the same, except that because some stored procedures are a little wonky, and my schema has a little trouble producing the script for them, -M will use DB schema to produce the source code for the procedures only, in my schema to do all the other files. Okay. Let's see. There is, where is it? There it is. The -n option will create all the check constraints and foreign key constraints with the no validate option, so that your load will go. You're creating the constraints will run faster, because obviously they're not checking. Right? We know the data is clean from when we unloaded it. Hopefully, the foreign keys are clean as well, but that is an option. Okay. So that is the second way that we can get around inconsistencies in the data, because we're not locking the database. Obviously, then you have to go do some cleanup if you know that your data is, or suspect your data is not consistent. Okay. The third way is right here, is the -O option, which I skipped over. And what that does is it unloads the data in dependency order. It unloads the children before the parents. So all the dependent tables get unloaded before their parent tables. And that's to make sure that if we're adding new parents, there won't have been any children for those parents at the time the children were unloaded. The original version of the -O option unloaded parents first and then children in dependency order, and that line is still in the script if you have a need to do it the other way around. If you have a database where parents are being deleted over time, and so children might get orphaned, then you want to go reinstate the old line, which is commented out. But this seems to be a more common problem, is new parent codes being added in the middle of the day rather than codes being deleted. So this is the current version. So that's the third way that we avoid inconsistent data when it's reloaded. Okay. -U will create a file that has update statistics commands to recreate the current level of distributions for every table in the database as a separate file. My import will see that there is a distributions script, and it will run the distribution script after everything else. Or you can pass where is it? There it is, the -V option, which will do the same thing, but put those update statistics commands into the schema files themselves. Not my preference, but that was the original way I did it. And the -U came later. You can avoid passing either one of these, and pass an option to my import to run do stats at the end of the data load. That is an option in my import. So you don't have to pass either U or V on the export side if you're going to do it on the import side. Okay. That's it. Oh, and you can optionally change the escape character if you have a problem with the escape character, the default escape character when we do an export, either with external tables or with SQL unload. Okay, that's the way that my export works. My import, we looked at some of the options. Let's look at the rest. Again, we want my import. There we go. Goes here again. We want to keep things simple, so the basic command is my import database -I and a path. Basically the same thing you would type to DB import. Okay, for a simplest DB import. Keep in mind that my export and my import are equivalent to doing a DB export minus SS and importing that, because we always include the locations of every object in the export metadata. Okay, unlike the default for DB export, which does not include storage metadata. Okay. Okay, now let's go through the basic options first, and then we'll come back to these first two, which are very important. Okay, especially when you're migrating your database from one machine to another or from one location to another. Okay. Dash E and dash N are relate to the dash N and um, yeah, dash N and dash V. I forget the other option for my export that ignores the oh, and the R option that ignores the doesn't create a new schema. Dash E assumes the database already exists, and this is a reload, so all the tables are empty, but they're there. Okay. Um, and Dash M assumes that the database already exists, but the tables need to be imported. There's a slight difference in how they behave. Okay. Not important enough to talk about. These are not commonly used, but if you have an existing database and you're bringing in data from multiple sources into a central database, these are options you would use. Okay. If you have auto locate set and you want to override that, the dash capital S option will let you do that. Okay. Override the auto locate flag during the load. Dash P will by default load all your tables in parallel. Again, that's all of your tables in parallel. But in my import, there is an R option that lets you set the number of parallel threads to use. You also can set a threshold on the number of threads to use maximum and how many threads should be left before we kick off some more. So for example, you can do a dash P, a dash R, dash M10, dash capital R5. So we will launch 10 threads, and when we're down to 5 threads, we'll launch 5 more. Okay, or when we're down to 4 threads, we'll launch 6 more. Basically, we'll boost it back up to 10. And the reason we're letting it ramp up and down is to allow larger tables to load a little bit faster as the smaller tables get loaded. Okay, but maintaining some parallelism. So that is an option. And since we have some control over that, it tends to be usable. Okay, because you can limit the number of load threads to the number of cores you have, or twice the number of cores you have, something reasonable. Okay. Okay, moving on. Dash E does all the external table unloading. The format of the external table unload is created by myexport at the time it's exported, because myexport writes out the metadata scripts that myimport-e uses. So however, if you unload it in binary format and Informix format, external table, and you pass -e to myimport, you will be loading Informix mode binary in express mode. Okay, assuming your database is unlogged. And we'll get to that in a second, because you get to specify the logging mode when the database is created. Okay. You can use the HP loader. Okay. Also, if you're using the default loader, you can specify that the my import commit every n records so that you avoid long transaction rollbacks for very large tables. Okay, very important when you're doing a default load. Not an option when we're doing external table loads, but that's why you would want to create the database in unlogged mode to avoid that problem. Okay. You can pass in -z and decompress the data, but again, it does detect that the files are compressed, and it will uncompress them. Okay. Dash M says run the constraint files after the load. I believe this is now redundant because I think that's been automated. I have to check on that. I haven't actually looked at why the command is still in the help anymore. -u says run the distribution script that would have been created with the -u option in my export. Okay. -U says just run do stats. When everything is done, all the data is loaded, all the constraints and indexes have been created, run do stats. Okay. And that will run that do stats with reasonable options. Okay. Here again for passwords when you're running in default mode. Okay. With the -L, you specify the logging mode of the database when you create it. If no -L, no log is assumed, that's not true. I have to fix that. If you want no log, you have to do -L no log. But you can do -L buffered and -L unbuff. Okay. Um, and you will get your database logged or not logged in the proper mode. Okay. Again, you get to specify the escape character to use. Okay, which doesn't affect external table unloads and loads because those delimiters, those escape characters were set in the metadata scripts by myexport. So this would only be effective for a default load. Okay, using DB access to do the load. I said we were going to come back to this. So -C in the unload metadata scripts for external table loads is a full path to the data file. If you're moving that .exp directory from one machine to another or from one directory to another, those paths are no longer going to be valid. So -C lets you specify that you want to overwrite those paths. And basically you specify the path that's currently in the files. They'll all be the same. So basically it's the path where the EXP, it's the parent of the EXP directory where it was exported. My import will go through the metadata files and overwrite them with the current path of the EXP directory's parent. Okay, and that's how you fix that. And the -T is if you want to replace the DB scheme, since we specify the storage options for all the tables and indexes in the schema when we use myexport. If you want to load the data into different DB spaces, you can provide a mapping file that contains a map. Take every index that's in this DB space and put it in that DB space. Take every table that's in this DB space and put it in that DB space. Or put everything that's in this DB space into some other DB space. So you can do that mapping. And -T lets you specify the file that has that mapping in it. Okay, it's similar to the on-tape reader -R rename that's used for remapping during a restore. It's very similar to that. Okay. And that's pretty much it. There was something else that popped into my head a minute ago and ran right back out again. Okay, not sure. That's it.